this study was on spirituality and how that can contribute to a peaceful organization. The main questions were, how are spirituality, psychological capital, and nonviolence related? And what does this show us about peace in the workplace? So the authors conducted a study with 347 participants, all of whom worked in three different sectors, financial, manufacturing, and IT. And all participants were at least an executive or a manager and had been with their company at least 2 years. What they did is they provided them different question sets related to spirituality, psychological capital, and nonviolent work behavior. And then they were asked to rate themselves on a Likert scale for each one. So if we go to the next slide. So what they found is that nonviolent behavior in the workplace is actually pretty largely related to one's spirituality. And it's important to note that in the study, they do recognize spirituality can mean religious based, but it is not always. It can be things such as yoga, meditation, mindfulness practices. So in this study, they looked at the 4 dimensions of spirituality, which were a meaningful life, connection with transcendence, faith, and practicing spirituality. And they found that those were strongly linked to psychological capital, which there's 4 dimensions of that, which are hope, optimism, resilience, and self-efficacy. So they looked and saw that if you're more spiritual, you might have, in general, about different situations, more hope or optimism. So if you're facing a challenge, and you have, strong faith, for instance, that things are usually going to be positive or work out, then you can kind of face that challenge saying, it's okay, I got this, I'll be able to move forward past it. And what they found is that that can help in the workplace to reduce nonviolent behavior, which it's also important to note that violence doesn't necessarily mean physical, but you can approach things with basically just a different attitude. And so if you have a conflict with a coworker, rather than responding negatively or pushing that farther because you're angry about it or you don't see an end to it, you might have more hope to approach that situation and kind of work a way out of it that's more positive. So it does put a lot of the burden in some way on the person who's more spiritual, because they're kind of approaching it in the sense that you won't react as negatively to situations. But the positive is that overall what that does, though, is it holds a little bit more peace, because so long as that person's approaching it genuinely, there isn't going to be a lot of resentment or anything either. So basically, spirituality is at the core of many positive outcomes and outlooks, and organizations can benefit from incorporating spirituality into facets of their culture and training. Hopefully that will encourage a majority, so that it's not just those on one side or the other, that there could be a more generally based spiritual environment where people feel those more positive emotions and are able to embrace things with a better outlook.
So spirituality, some version of spirituality, it seems like it reinforces these dimensions of psychological capital, which then impact abilities to sort of nonviolent communication and nonviolent practices. Does that seem right?
That's exactly it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Kind of makes sense. It kind of reminds me of what we were just talking about, just like because a lot of spirituality, especially the mystical traditions, they focus on the idea of the illusion of the mind. And if you are sort of metacognitively aware of an illusion that you're kind of living in, and you have some sort of ability to distance yourself from the illusion of everyday life, maybe your ego and that kind of thing, it's easier to be in a nonviolent place and have compassion and communicate openly and not be so defensive or attached to like ego threats and stuff, if you can be that sort of witness to the illusion that you're living in. Maybe that's part, I don't know, maybe that's part of it. It depends, I guess, on what sort of spirituality you practice.
And I think, yeah, that's important to note. I think, definitely, I mean, there's various ones that you could approach it with. But I think overall that's a really good point. And I feel like to some level that is kind of what they're getting at. As mentioned, in some regard, it kind of puts the burden, so to speak, on the person who's more spiritual. So I guess in some ways, like you said, what's their level to like rise above those kinds of things. But
Mhm.
um, but overall, I mean, if you get a workplace where that's kind of at least generally just that mindfulness, the hope is that more and more people will kind of at least approach things with that mindset of climbing above it, or just not reacting in the moment.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how they talk about spirituality, and spirituality is like, could be a piece of religion, but it's not necessarily religion. And because there's a lot of, religion is partly ideology, and ideologies are the things that get people into conflict a lot of times. But there's so many good aspects to religion too, the spiritual parts of it, that help people bond together, have compassion for each other and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, this element of religion really is the spiritual part of religion, is a really helpful piece in work, in conflict in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And they did mention a couple practices that have kind of been, more or less incorporated in some sense from different religions too. So that's a good point to note. Kind of what you can
Yeah.
take from those.
Yeah.
That's cool. It reminds me of our mindfulness panel that we had just a month or so ago. Just all, I mean, it is related, and it's cool to see it relate specifically to nonviolence in the workplace.
Mhm.
Which I feel like that's a very specific thing that you wouldn't typically have studies focusing
Yeah.
on spirituality in the workplace. So I think that's cool.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. I mean, if more companies were able to offer even just like meditation classes or anything that allows people to feel more connected to something larger than themselves, I think that'd probably be a good.
Yeah, and I mean, there, companies that, are building meditation rooms
Yeah.
and building in space in the workday for like quiet time and things like that. And I saw a story, and it's actually on the news, of a school, it may have been a school for children that had behavioral problems, but they have started teaching the children yoga, and it's a daily thing, and
Wow.
meditation. And the incidence of outbursts and bad behaviors has like dropped to almost nothing. I mean, and the children are taking
Wow.
these home, and it's helping them, to manage their emotions and their behaviors at home and everything. And um, you know, it's I thought it was great. And these were little kids, like elementary aged children. And I saw a similar story where they're doing it in high schools, in a particular high school during COVID, and how that's really helping the teenagers with their stress levels. Um, and even getting a sort of thing. And so it doesn't have to be hard. I mean, like literally just, 8:45 every morning, we have 15 minutes of silence. It doesn't have to be tied to anything in
Yeah.
particular, any particular religion. But the burden part that you mentioned, Natalie, is so like that's one thing. Like when I have to coach someone, and we're getting towards the end of the program, and like you're going to be doing this on your own. I always tell them that. I was like, now that you know more of the burden is going to be placed on you for how this relationship goes, because you know more now. You know things now that they don't know. We've been working on things they haven't been working on, and we can't control their behavior. We can't control what they do, what they say. But now you're in a space where you can better control what you do and what you say. So
Mhm.
it's not fair. But the burden of how this goes on will be on you. You have the greater responsibility. And then
It links.
sometimes they, what? I'm leaving this job. I'm quitting.
Yeah. It links into like emotional intelligence even.
Yep.
Another facet of this that I was thinking of, as you mentioned, the elementary kids too, is that it's kind of a level of just well-being in general, and just kind of acknowledging certain needs for people. Maybe maybe those kids needed that time to channel their energy into something else and to be quiet, and just have that more, simple space. So I think if you do that in the workplace, I think it provides people, if you mentioned like a quiet space or something, there's a level of that that's tied to spirituality, and a level of that that I think is just tied to your general well-being. And naturally when your needs are being met, things tend to go a little bit smoother. So